this is before we have put any color down. This is the pale Prosaide color and this is the pale silicone color. So you can see they are slightly different, but close enough to my skin tone that I can get away with just adjusting the undertones rather than having to adjust the lightness or darkness of the piece themselves, which is ideal. So while we've got them both here unpainted, I'll get you to have a look at the movement of them both, and then we'll put paint on them and I'll go through it in a bit more detail. So for me, I can always see when I move them that the cap plastic tends to wrinkle around the edge. Whereas because you don't really have an edge made of a different material on here, that tends to look a little bit more realistic to me and move a little bit nicer. I think part of the reason of that is because this is all just Prosaide. So you've got your skin and then Prosaide. If you had to patch anything, it's still Prosaide, whereas this is Prosaide adhesive and silicone and cap plastic and skin, and they're all going to move slightly different from each other. And probably it is more noticeable because you've got the cap plastic on a flat surface, whereas when this ends and becomes the flat surface of your skin, it's just skin. You don't need that edge to blend it in because of the way the material works. So for me, the silicone always looks a little bit faker and it takes a little bit longer for me to apply it. The reason that I would pick silicone over Prosaide is based on how they're made. Silicone is just a lot quicker to get ready and less constraints in what you can and can't make with it. I'll go over that in more detail after we put the color down as well. Let's see how the light is catching that. Yeah, it helps a little bit. You can get probably an even better idea of how it matches into the skin and how it moves. So for my Prosaide transfer here, it looks quite natural. Even when I kind of pull it up, it tends to wrinkle with the skin. I would be careful about poking and prodding it too much. Because we've got sealer over it, it makes it less sticky and you can kind of poke and prod it a little bit, but if you do squeeze it too hard, it can stick to itself and get a little bit damaged. Whereas the silicone, you can poke and prod a lot and it will bounce back. You just gotta be careful of not pulling up your cap plastic edges or anything like that. So it's like a little bit more resilient to really kind of poke and prod. But yeah, just be careful of pulling up your cap plastic edges. And then you can see when this one moves as it gets wrinkled, it does tend to wrinkle throughout the cap plastic and give your edges a little bit more of an obviousness. But if you are, skilled with silicone prosthetics and you practice a lot, there are different ways around that to avoid it. But as a beginner, Prosaide will be much easier to get nicer edges and a little bit more seamless movement. Tell you a little bit of information about my opinion of what's the pros and cons and what circumstances you're more likely to use a Prosaide transfer versus a silicone prosthetic. A lot of this is in relation to how they're made as well. I've got a section on how they're made that you can watch through, and that kind of informs which ones you can use for what as well, because there are limitations for what you can make into a Prosaide transfer. Silicone is just a lot more easy to make in terms of how big you can go, if you can go curved, how quick it is to make it, but then silicone's it takes longer to apply, and Prosaide is a lot faster, so they've got their own pros and cons. Let's go into it, shall we? Silicone is more commonly used because of how fast you can make it in a workshop. So if you are going to buy prosthetics online, it is more common to be able to find things in silicone than it is in Prosaide. And if you were to work on a production, you definitely want to have a lot of Prosaide transfers already made before you go into it, just in case you need backups and you can't wait 2 weeks for a Prosaide transfer to dehydrate to be ready. Versus a silicone prosthetic, if anything happens, you need a new one, you can whip one up in an hour and have it demolded and have it ready to go. You don't have to wait weeks and weeks for dehydration. So because of the quickness and the ease of making silicone prosthetics, within a time limit, that does make them a lot more common. And also the added ability to be able to make more things with silicone, the fact that you can have really deep silicone things, versus if you were to try and do something really deep with Prosaide, it would never dry all the way through the center. Versus silicone being a chemical reaction, you can have a really thick silicone piece and it takes the exact same amount of time to cure and be ready as a thin silicone piece. It also helps you can have curved things, so if you needed to have a nose, if you needed to have a ball cap, if you needed to have a chin, anything that has to have a curve to it, you can make in silicone, whereas you can't make it in Prosaide because of the process. So it's a lot more options for what you can make in silicone versus Prosaide, where it has to be thin and it has to be flat. Within that, there are still lots of things you can make with Prosaide, but you can't have anything curved, you can't have anything thick. So there are limitations that way, and you also have to have the time to be able to wait for it to dehydrate. If you have the time to wait a few days up to a few weeks before application and it is a thin flat thing, then Prosaide obviously is going to be, you know, about the same amount of effort for you to make as silicone. When it comes to the actual application on set, Prosaide is a lot faster to apply than silicone because you can stick it down, wet it, pull it off, and just fix any loose edges with a bit of isopropyl alcohol on a cotton tip, versus silicone where you have to make sure you're gluing down the right amount of cap plastic and you're blending off the right amount of cap plastic and then patching it and all that. Like silicone does just generally take a lot longer to apply. The other thing is Prosaide, as well as being much quicker to apply, it does last a lot longer than silicone. I think part of that is the fact that it is made out of like an acrylic adhesive. So if you were to sweat underneath this, the sweat, it's like more waterproof and more sweat proof than silicone, because silicone's just a piece of rubber. There is no airflow coming to your skin, and the sweat can kind of lift it almost as like one rubbery piece and get sweat bubbles trapped underneath it, whereas this is just adhesive stuck to the skin. So this is more waterproof, a little bit more sweat proof, and this definitely lasts a lot longer on set that I've noticed when I've been on set than silicone, because the edges don't tend to lift as much, whereas a piece of rubber with cap plastic edges is a bit more prone to being sweated underneath, a bit more prone to the edges lifting, and it just, you know, being affected by the movement a lot more than this is. So if you want longevity as well, or if you have harsher conditions that you're shooting in, something that's a really long day or really sweaty or like in water, Prosaide is going to be a better choice. The longevity of Prosaide though also comes with its own cons. It is a lot harder to remove, and I have had experience where the Prosaide just it won't come off somebody's skin, and you're just there for so long, and you end up having to have like a hot shower or go into a sauna. Some people's skin, it just sucks it in, and for others it comes off relatively easy, but silicone's always going to be easier to remove because it is just one piece of rubber that you can get like a brush underneath and peel off, versus this, which is just like falling apart, and the remover's making it reactivate into glue and get really gluggy and soggy and stick to everything. This is a lot more of a pain in the ass to remove at the end of the day, especially if there's lots of it on somebody. That could be consideration if you don't have a lot of time at the end of the day, or if your actor's skin absorbs it, this might not be the best choice. And then we kind of already talked about and looked at the cap plastic, but there is more of a risk that you're going to mess up the application if you do burn through cap plastic and expose an edge, versus this application, which is less likely. You know, you can keep kind of blending the edges and it's not really going to expose an edge or expose the prosthetic in the same way. This has a little bit more of a risk to it in terms of it being messed up, and then also more of a risk of the edges being shown from them being crinkly, from them being shiny than this is. This is easier. This is a little bit more risky in terms of the realism of it and the edges of it. In saying that this is easier to remove, I've just read another note that I've written down. Sometimes silicone can delaminate. And what that means is the cap plastic that's on the back and the front of the silicone that encapsulates the silicone, because silicone itself is so sticky and soft, and it wouldn't come out of a mold without it being encapsulated in this nice firm plastic. So what can happen is when you're removing it, you've got the glue, and then you've got the cap plastic, and then you've got the silicone. Instead of the prosthetic coming off as one piece, it leaves that bottom layer of cap plastic on the skin, and this is called delamination. So then effectively you have to remove it twice. You remove the silicone, and then you notice this shiny layer of cap plastic over the whole skin, and you have to remove the cap plastic as well, which can double the removal time. Sometimes you can try and chase it back to the silicone, but that can be an issue with silicone removal as well. Just thought I should, it doesn't happen all the time, but I just thought I should put that in as another little note. Another thing to consider with the application of the two things are that if you're applying it the way that we've applied it on the transfer paper, is you can't see exactly where the Prosaide transfer is going when you apply it. Versus the silicone, you can line up exactly where you want it. This, you're a little bit more blinded by having that piece of cardboard over your prosthetic piece. So even though this is faster to apply, this can be a little bit easier for having an exact placement. If you need an exact placement for like an eye bag or a scar, you need it to line up with something. Or if you need it for continuity, so you need it to be applied in the exact same place and the exact same orientation every day so it looks the same on film, it can be a little bit easier to do that with silicone, where you can see exactly where it's going instead of Prosaide. I mean, drawing that line does help, but you still haven't got as much visual information as you would when applying a silicone piece. And I will show you in the next one how to apply Prosaide right out of the mold, which does correct that a little bit, but this is a more common way that you'll find Prosaide transfers, so I thought I would address it from that viewpoint for this. Prosaide, you can obviously get a little bit closer to hairlines and edges of mouths and stuff like that, because you don't have to accommodate those few millimeters of cap plastic edge. So if you do need to get something really close to the edge of a face, a hairline, an orifice, whatever it is, you can get it closer with Prosaide transfers than silicone. So that's another thing to consider about the two pieces. I did mention earlier that the silicone is a little bit more resilient to being touched. So if you want to be able to have somebody grab a wound, squeeze it together, suture it up, whatever it is, the silicone is a lot hardier and a lot more resistant to that kind of touching, whereas Prosaide transfers are more likely to get damaged by that kind of stuff. You can't really suture them up or squeeze them together as freely as you can with silicone if you need something that can be touched a lot. The other thing that can happen with Prosaide is, as the day goes on, as the sealer wears off, it can become a little bit sticky again. And when it becomes sticky, obviously it can stick to clothes, it can stick to props, armor, like whatever it is. Like one, it can cause it to stick to something and be pulled off and be damaged if it gets too sticky. Or two, you can end up with a nice layer of fluff stuck to your prosthetic transfer, whereas that wouldn't really happen to a silicone thing. So the stickiness of Prosaide can come back, and that can be an issue. I've also had the stickiness be an issue when applying something to somebody's face, where I was applying multiple pieces for an age makeup and I hadn't sealed them all because I was going to seal them all at the same time, and I found my hand accidentally stuck to their face on one of the Prosaide transfers as I was leaning on it to do a different transfer. So the stickiness of it can cause different problems with application all throughout the day, that is a lot stickier than a silicone piece and can be harder to deal with. Another pro and con to think about is that you don't need adhesive for the Prosaide transfer. It is its own adhesive, which saves a step and saves some products. This does need adhesive. We've used Prosaide with it today, which is fine, but generally it does work better and last a bit longer if you use a silicone adhesive, and silicone adhesives are very expensive. The Telesis range for like 2 bottles, maybe like a thinner that big and a adhesive that big, cost me $250 Australian, whereas a bottle of Prosaide, you can probably get like a huge bottle like that for like $50. Not that you have to use silicone adhesive, but it does work better, and that's an added cost and an added step that you should consider with Prosaide versus silicone. And then the other thing to consider is the solvents that you use. So this one you obviously need adhesive to dissolve the edges on the acetone based cap plastic, whereas you don't need acetone for this one. You can use a gentler solvent like isopropyl alcohol, but also if you get nice enough edges and you can use the water to blend it out, you might not even need to use isopropyl alcohol on the edges. Not that that really matters because you're using isopropyl alcohol to paint it anyway, but you can get away with gentler solvents on Prosaide transfers versus needing a little bit of a harsher solvent on the silicone appliance. Another thing to consider. But on the other side of that, the flip side, you generally need a stronger adhesive remover for the Prosaide transfers that has a little bit more solvents in it to get this off the skin easily, versus silicone appliances where you can get away with a little bit of a gentler, oilier, less solventy remover for the skin for silicone. So their own kind of pros and cons on the flip side. And then with the painting, they're both kind of similar to paint and put blood on and all that stuff. That's fairly similar. There's not really a whole bunch of pros and cons to that process. It's more the application and the mattifying and the longevity and the removal where these two differ from each other. So it's one thing to show you a flawless application from start to finish and my tips for doing that, but it's a whole other thing to show you the mistakes so you can see what can go wrong, what it looks like when it goes wrong, so you can visually identify problems in your own work if it happens because you've become familiar with what those things look like, and then tips on how to fix it and tips on how to avoid it so you have an easier process applying prosthetics. So we're going to look specifically at things like cap plastic edges and how those can go wrong and how to fix them. Color matching skin tones is a big thing that people struggle with, so I've gone really in depth with how I color match skin tones to make them look more realistic, and like lots of tips and tricks on how to make it easier for you and how to train your eye into seeing those colors. Also things like blending colors around the edges of wounds, especially if you have like an infected aura, how to get that blending looking a little bit more realistic using alcohol paints, and then also blood application and how to get blood application looking more natural as well.